My name is Erica Tanner. I'm 31 years old, and I am a sergeant in the United States Army. I am used to following orders, I am used to silence, and I am more than used to being invisible. But today, in the most prestigious law office in Washington, D.C., my invisibility was painfully sharp. As the Walker family tore at the general's legacy, his grandson Preston glanced at my uniform, smirked, and said just loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Mr. Daniels, can we speed this up? I'd rather not waste oxygen in the same room as the hired help sent to change an old man's diapers." His words were a knife to my pride, and when his mother, Eleanor, added, "Oh, Preston, don't be like that. She did her job after all." Her payment is in the envelope on the desk. I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. They thought I was the help. They had no idea that the general's final order wasn't in his will. It was in the old, cold key currently sitting in my pocket. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been made to feel like an outsider by the very people who were supposed to be family. The training kicks in before the mind does. It's a reflex hammered into you through thousands of hours of drills under the blistering Carolina sun. Back straight, chin up, eyes forward. You become a statue of discipline, a silent testament to the uniform you wear. My Army service uniform was perfectly pressed, the brass on my lapels gleaming under the recessed lighting of the conference room. To an outsider, I was the picture of military composure. But inside, I was suffocating. The air in the Covington and Burling boardroom was thick, a cloying mixture of old money and fresh tension. It smelled of rich mahogany, leather-bound books that were never read, and the competing perfumes of the Walker women, heavy floral scents that seemed to wage their own silent war in the middle of the table. I stood at parade rest near the door, my role undefined, my presence an unwelcome anomaly. I could feel their eyes on me, quick dismissive glances that didn't see a soldier. They saw a piece of furniture that didn't match the decor. Preston Walker, the eldest grandson, was the conductor of this orchestra of contempt. Dressed in a Brioni suit that probably cost more than my car, he made a show of checking his Patek Philippe every few minutes, his jaw tight with manufactured impatience. His wife, Clarissa, a woman sculpted from porcelain and disdain, would occasionally lean in and whisper something in his ear. A cruel little smile would play on his lips, and they'd share a quiet, sharp laugh. They weren't even trying to be subtle. I dug my fingernails into the flesh of my palms, the faint sting a welcome anchor to the present moment. This is just another mission, Tanner, I told myself. The internal command crisp and clear. Observe, report, and do not engage. But my body betrayed me. A familiar dryness crept into my throat, the kind you get before a long ruck march, the kind that tells you you're already dehydrated. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, and every breath I took felt borrowed from their rarefied air. The men in the room, uncles and cousins, all bore the same mark of their tribe, heavy West Point rings on their fingers. Their conversation was a low hum of defense contracts and upcoming regattas in Annapolis, a language of power I understood but could never speak. They spoke around me, through me, as if I were a ghost. Then Mr. Daniels cleared his throat. He was a portly man with a kind face, but today his expression was all business, a legal fortress against the family's avarice. He began to read General Walker's last will and testament. The numbers were staggering. Millions in trusts, sprawling estates in Virginia Hunt Country, a beachfront property in Naples, Florida. The Walkers leaned forward, their faces tight with anticipation, like wolves waiting for the kill to be divided. And to be present for this reading, as per the general's explicit written instruction, Mr. Daniels continued, his eyes scanning the document. Sergeant Erica Tanner. My name, spoken aloud, shattered the room's delicate tension. From across the table, Preston let out a sound, a soft, dismissive pfft, a puff of air that carried more insult than a shouted curse. It was the sound of something insignificant being flicked away. I kept my eyes locked on a point on the far wall, focusing on the grain of the wood. Do not engage. But the true assault came moments later. Mr. Daniels arrived at a clause detailing a small trust set aside for those who provided dedicated care in the general's final months. Before he could even finish the sentence, Preston's mother, Eleanor, a woman with a ramrod posture that matched my own, turned her cold blue eyes directly on me. "Her payment is in the envelope on the desk, Sergeant," she said, her voice smooth and coated in a veneer of condescending politeness. "Thank you for your service." The words landed like a physical blow. In that single, elegantly delivered sentence, she had stripped me of my rank, my dignity, and my purpose. She had reduced my final silent duty to the general, a duty performed out of respect for a fellow soldier, into a cash transaction. It wasn't just disrespect, it was a public execution of my honor. The blood in my veins didn't just feel cold, it felt like it had stopped moving altogether, a frozen river of humiliation. The room was silent, the family watching me, waiting for a reaction. For me to flinch, to crumble, to take the envelope and disappear. I did none of those things. I simply stood there, my spine a steel rod. It was then that Mr. Daniels, seemingly sensing the need to move forward, asked the question that lit the fuse. "Sergeant Tanner," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "For the record, do you know the identity of your biological parents?" The air was sucked out of the room. Every ounce of their previous contempt now sharpened into a single point of cruel, predatory curiosity. Preston leaned back in his chair, a slow, malicious grin spreading across his face. "Oh, for God's sake," he drawled, his voice dripping with theatrical sarcasm. "Don't tell me my father knocked up another one of the staff? The old man certainly had a taste for waitresses." That was it. The shot was fired. It wasn't just at me anymore. It was an attack on my mother, a woman he'd never met, a woman I barely knew myself. A white-hot rage, an emotion I had been trained for years to master and suppress, surged in my chest. It felt like a live grenade. My training screamed at me to contain it, to lock it down. So I did the only thing I could. I pulled my shoulders back even further, my posture becoming a physical shield against the shrapnel of his words. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Just as the tension reached its peak, Mr. Daniels brought his hand down flat on the table. The sound was a sharp, authoritative crack that silenced the room instantly. "That is enough, Preston," he commanded, his lawyerly demeanor replaced by the raw power of an executor. "Sergeant Tanner's presence here is a non-negotiable requirement of the generals. All will be explained in due course." He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw a flicker of something I hadn't expected. A mixture of deep sympathy and a stern command. It was a look that said, "Hold the line, soldier." The meeting eventually concluded with the walkers sweeping out of the room, their greed momentarily soured by the unresolved mystery of my presence. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the vast, cold marble lobby. The silence was deafening, broken only by the echo of Preston's final, venomous words. The lawyer's question about my parents swirled in my head, a painful, unanswered variable in the equation of my life. I was no longer just a soldier finishing a mission. Standing there, in the heart of their power, I had become the target in a war I didn't even understand. Standing in that cold marble lobby, the echoes of Preston Walker's insults faded, replaced by the much louder ghosts of my own past. His words were just the salt in a wound that had been open for 22 years. The lawyer's question, "Do you know the identity of your biological parents?" was the key that unlocked it all, and my mind, without permission, drifted back. Back to a small, perpetually damp apartment in Fayetteville, North Carolina, just outside the gates of Fort Bragg. We were what they call military brats, but without the benefits of living on post. Our life was a series of off-base apartments with peeling paint and questionable plumbing, always just on the edge of the world we served. And in that world, my mother, Madison, was my entire universe. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman who worked 2 jobs and still managed to have a hot meal on the table every night. But she had a secret, a sadness she kept locked away. I was 9 the first time I saw it. I came into the kitchen for a glass of water and found her sitting at our small formica table, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. In her hands, she was holding an old, worn wooden box. It was dark, maybe walnut, and the corners were smooth and rounded from years of handling. The lid was slightly ajar, and I caught a glimpse of what was inside. The glint of a silver dog tag, a faded photograph of a soldier I didn't recognize. Her gaze was distant, lost in a place I couldn't see. It was a profound, adult sadness, the kind a child can feel but never understand. She didn't hear me approach. I stood there for a long moment, watching her trace the edge of the box with her finger. When she finally looked up and saw me, her entire posture changed. She snapped the box shut with a sharp, definitive click. Her voice, usually warm, became hard, almost brittle. "It's nothing, honey," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just some old shrapnel from a forgotten war." And just like that, a wall went up. It was an invisible barrier, but it was as real as the chain-link fence surrounding the base. I knew, even at 9 years old, that this was off-limits. The box, the photo, the man in it, they were part of a battle she was still fighting alone, a territory I was never allowed to enter. I never asked about the box again. But the emptiness it represented found other ways to haunt me. The memory that followed was sharper, more painful. I was in the 6th grade, that awkward age where fitting in is more important than breathing. Our middle school was hosting its annual father-daughter dance. The week leading up to it was a flurry of excitement. My friends Sarah and Jessica chattered endlessly about their new dresses from JCPenney, about who they hoped would play the slow songs, about how their dads were going to drive them. I listened in silence, a knot tightening in my stomach. That night, I found my mom in the living room, folding laundry. I asked the question with the fragile hope of a 12-year-old. "Mom," I started, my voice small. "Can I go?" She stopped folding. She held a t-shirt in her hands, her knuckles white. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Finally, she put the shirt down, came over, and pulled me into a fierce hug. Her embrace was my fortress, my safe harbor, but it couldn't protect me from this. "We're a team, Erica," she whispered into my hair, her voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "I'm the commander. You're my soldier. We don't need anyone else." That night, I stayed home. I sat in my bedroom window, watching the cars pull up to the school gymnasium across the street. I could hear the faint thump of the music, the muffled bursts of laughter carrying on the humid Carolina air. Every beat of the bass was a reminder of my otherness. The feeling of being left behind, of being fundamentally different from everyone else in the world, had never been so clear. It was the first time I understood that the empty space where a father should have been wasn't just a missing name on a birth certificate. It was a tangible void, a scar that burned brightest on nights like this. My mother passed away from a sudden illness when I was 18. Just like that, my commander was gone, and I was a soldier without a unit. I stood at a crossroads. I could keep my job waiting tables at the Waffle House on Bragg Boulevard, serving coffee to soldiers coming off late shifts, my life forever on the periphery of the world I grew up in. Or I could do something else, something to change my own destiny. One evening, I walked to the edge of the base, to the fence that had always separated my world from theirs. I leaned against the cold metal, watching the soldiers running drills on the field under the harsh glare of the high-voltage lights. I watched their synchronized movements, heard the rhythmic cadence of their calls. I didn't see the hardship, I saw purpose. I saw a family forged not by blood, but by shared struggle and mutual respect. A place where your worth was measured by your actions, your integrity, your commitment. Not by who your father was or wasn't. That was the night I made my vow. "I'm going to enlist," I promised myself, my breath fogging in the cool air. "I'm going to build my own identity. I will never again let anyone else have the power to define who I am." It wasn't a reckless decision made out of grief. It was a calculated act of survival. And now, standing back in the cold marble reality of the present, the bitter irony of it all washed over me. I had spent more than a decade in the Army doing exactly that. I had forged an identity from sweat, discipline, and dedication. I had built a name for myself based on honor. And in less than 5 minutes, the Walker family had demolished it all. They had reduced me back to zero, to nothing more than a nameless, rootless girl with a questionable past. Preston's sneering words weren't just a personal insult. They were a negation of my entire life's journey, a dismissal of every drop of sweat, every tear, every ounce of blood I had poured into becoming the woman I was. The familiar, helpless anger began to boil inside me, the same anger that 12-year-old girl felt looking out her window. But then another thought cut through the rage, sharp and clear. No. I'm not that 9-year-old girl staring at a locked box anymore. A new fire began to smolder in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't the hot, reckless fire of my youth. This was different. It was a slow, controlled burn. A pilot light of determination, just waiting for the right moment to ignite. If you've ever had to build your own strength from the ground up because you felt like you had no one else, hit that like button to show your support. And in the comments, just type a simple, "I did it," to honor your own journey. The slow-burning pilot light in my gut ignited the moment the boardroom doors swung open. The walkers filed out, their faces a mixture of smug satisfaction and irritation at having been delayed. Preston led the procession, his arrogance rolling off him in waves. As he passed me, he didn't just walk by. He angled his body, deliberately bumping his shoulder hard into mine. It was a petty schoolyard move, a final assertion of dominance. He leaned in close, his voice a low hiss that smelled faintly of expensive scotch. "Take your money and get out. This world isn't for your kind." My training is to de-escalate, to remain impassive. But my instinct, the one honed on the streets of Fayetteville, was to react. I didn't move a muscle, but I met his gaze. My eyes, I'm sure, were as sharp and cold as bayonets. I didn't need to say a word. He saw the fight in me, and for a split second, his smirk faltered. Before the moment could break, Mr. Daniels appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the frame. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a drill sergeant's command on a silent morning. "Mr. Walker," he said, the title Mr. sounding more like an indictment than a courtesy, "your conduct is shameful." The entire Walker clan froze, turning to stare. Mr. Daniels ignored them, his gaze finding me. "Sergeant Tanner, would you please come in?" His words were a shield. His unexpected defense sent a ripple of shock through the family. I saw Eleanor's perfectly powdered face tighten, her lips a thin, disapproving line. For the first time all day, I felt a crack in the ice that had formed around my heart. A tiny, unfamiliar warmth seeped through. I gave Preston one last level look before stepping past him, my back ramrod straight, and followed Mr. Daniels into his private office. The heavy oak door closed behind us with a soft, satisfying thud, shutting out the viper's nest. Through the frosted glass panel, I could just make out Preston's silhouette, gesturing angrily at me while talking to his sister. He was pointing, laughing. Even now, he couldn't resist. But in here, the air was different. It was safe. Mr. Daniels's office was a sanctuary of quiet power, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a faint smell of pipe tobacco and old paper, a large window overlooking the bustling streets of D.C. He was more than a lawyer. He was a keeper of secrets, a guardian at the gate. He gestured to a leather armchair, but I remained standing. I was still on duty. "Sergeant," he began, his voice low and serious, "what I'm about to tell you, General Walker kept confidential for over 30 years. He walked over to a heavy safe concealed behind a painting and returned with a single manila folder. It was stamped with a single, stark word in red ink. Top secret. He laid it on his polished desk. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The general asked me to unseal this only in the event of his passing, and only for you. My hands felt numb as I opened it. The first thing I saw was a photocopy of a birth certificate. The name on it was foreign to me, Madison Carter. My mother's name. Underneath it was a single sheet of paper with the general's official letterhead. The handwriting on it was shaky, the script of a man whose body was failing him. But the pressure of the pen on the paper spoke of unwavering authority. There were only 6 words. Find her, protect her at all costs. I stared at the words, my mind refusing to process them. Find who? Protect who? Mr. Daniels seemed to read my confusion. In his final days, Sergeant, the general began to suspect a deeper connection between you and his past. It was more than just your shared background at Fort Bragg. It was something in your eyes, he said. Something familiar. He explained that the general, frail and confined to his bed, had spent hours telling him stories, piecing together a puzzle that had haunted him for decades. My assignment to his care, a random posting from the Army Medical Command, had been the final, astonishing piece. Your mother, Mr. Daniels continued, his voice gentle now. Her name was Willow Spears. She was a private first class, a combat medic. He slid a photograph across the desk. It was a grainy, black and white picture of a U.S. Army medical team, dated 1991, Fort Bragg. There were a dozen faces, all young, all smiling for the camera. And in the middle of the back row, I saw her. It was my mother's face, but younger, brighter. Her eyes filled with a fiery passion I had never seen. She looked happy. And standing directly behind her, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, was a young captain with a confident, easy grin. It was Raymond Walker. He believed, Mr. Daniels said, his words landing like mortar shells, that Willow was his younger sister, the one who disappeared without a trace after a family tragedy. Sergeant, General Walker was your uncle. The room tilted. A grenade had just gone off in my mind, the shrapnel of this new reality tearing through everything I thought I knew. The locked wooden box, my mother's secrecy, her strange, fierce insistence that we were a self-contained unit. Every disconnected piece of my past suddenly slammed together, forming a picture I couldn't yet bear to look at. My mother, a soldier. The general, my uncle. Before I could find my voice, before I could even formulate a question, Mr. Daniels held out his hand. Resting in his palm was a key. It was an old-issue military footlocker key made of brass that had gone dull with age and use. It felt heavy, substantial. This is not part of the will, he said, his tone shifting back to one of official gravity. This is a final order. He closed my fingers around the key. It opens a personal footlocker in the general's study at his private residence in Great Falls, Virginia. He said you would know what to do. He went on to explain the general's reasoning. He hadn't reached out sooner for two reasons. First, he was afraid of disrupting the quiet, hidden life that my mother had so carefully constructed for us. He respected her strategic retreat. And second, more importantly, he feared the greed of his own family. He knew what they were capable of. The request for me to be his caregiver wasn't just for medical support, it was a final reconnaissance mission. A way to see his niece one last time, to confirm his suspicions without alerting the enemy. I looked down at the key in my hand. The cold metal bit into my palm, a solid, tangible piece of a life I never knew I had. This was no longer about their insults. It was no longer about a paycheck in an envelope. This was about a soldier's final command. This was a mission. The brass key felt like a lead weight in the pocket of my uniform as I drove my Ford F-150 out of D.C. The city's angry traffic and concrete canyons slowly gave way to the winding, tree-lined roads of Great Falls, Virginia. This was a different world. Here, power wasn't shouted from skyscrapers. It was whispered from behind 100-year-old oak trees and long, gated driveways. The houses were vast, hidden estates, fortresses of quiet influence belonging to the political and military elite. I followed the GPS until it announced I had arrived. Before me stood a pair of imposing wrought iron gates, flanked by a low stone wall that disappeared into the dense woods. Through the bars, I could see the general's residence, a stately colonial-style brick home that felt less like a house and more like a monument. It looked like a fortress, built to withstand a siege. And parked brazenly in the circular driveway, as if he owned the place, was Preston's silver Mercedes. My heart sank. The fragile sense of purpose I'd been nursing since leaving the lawyer's office evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. I wasn't ready to face them again. Not here. Not in this place that was supposed to hold answers. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the button on the call box. There was a soft buzz, and the heavy gates began to swing inward with a low, hydraulic hum. Waiting at the end of the drive was an elderly woman. She was slender, with a crown of perfectly coiffed silver hair and a crisp gray housekeeper's uniform. She stood with a quiet dignity that seemed to rival the house itself. This had to be Mrs. Avery, the General's longtime housekeeper. As I pulled my truck to a stop, she didn't look at the vehicle. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, were fixed on me, on the soldier stepping out of it. "Sergeant Tanner," she said. Her voice was warm but carried the formal weight of years of service. It was a voice that commanded respect without ever having to raise it. "Ma'am," I replied, giving a slight nod. "The General said you would come," she continued, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "He said a good soldier never leaves a mission unfinished." Her gaze flickered toward the main house. I could hear Preston's voice, loud and imperious, barking orders at someone inside. A fresh wave of anger and anxiety washed over me. Mrs. Avery must have seen it on my face. "This way, please," she said, her tone becoming quietly conspiratorial. "Some battles are best fought away from the front lines." She turned and led me away from the main entrance, down a side path made of crushed gravel that crunched softly under my boots. It was a simple, subtle act of protection, but it felt monumental. She was rerouting me, guiding me around the source of conflict, creating a safe passage into the heart of the fortress. As we walked through a manicured English garden, fragrant with late-blooming roses, she was silently telling me something the rest of the walkers never could. "You belong here." They were the invaders. I was the expected guest. The path led us to a side entrance that opened directly into a vast, country-style kitchen. The change in atmosphere was immediate and overwhelming. The air here wasn't sterile and tense like the DC law office. It was warm and alive. It smelled of freshly brewed coffee, lemon polish, and something sweet and spicy that instantly made my stomach rumble: gingerbread. "Please sit," she said, gesturing to a sturdy wooden chair at a large oak table in the center of the room. While I settled, she moved with an unhurried grace, taking a thick ceramic mug from a hook and filling it with steaming black coffee. She then opened a tin and placed a plate with 2 large, still-warm gingerbread cookies in front of me. The gesture was so simple, so maternal, it almost brought tears to my eyes. "The General loved these," she said, her voice softening as she looked at the cookies, her eyes gazing into a memory. "And so did his sister, Willow. Every time she came to visit her big brother, the first thing she'd do is run into this kitchen and demand gingerbread." Her words were a quiet confirmation, a thread of connection to the woman in the photograph. She wasn't just telling a story, she was handing me a piece of my own history, a legacy of gingerbread and sibling affection. I picked up a cookie. The warmth from it seeped into my fingertips, traveling up my arm and spreading through my chest, melting a small piece of the ice that had been lodged there for years. For the first time, my mother wasn't just a secret in a locked box. She was a girl who loved her brother and ran into kitchens looking for cookies. She was real. I took a bite. It tasted like home. Or rather, what I imagined home was supposed to taste like. After I finished my coffee, Mrs. Avery stood. "He wanted you to go directly to his study," she said, her voice returning to its gentle, formal tone. She led me out of the kitchen, through a quiet hallway, and up a grand, curving staircase. The walls were lined with the General's history, photographs of him with presidents, with foreign dignitaries, with his men in the field. The study was at the end of the hall. It was his sanctuary. It was exactly as I'd imagined, walls lined with books on military history and strategy, framed campaign maps from Desert Storm and Vietnam, display cases filled with medals, a silver star, a Purple Heart, a Distinguished Service Cross. And on a stand in the corner, folded with reverent precision, was a worn American flag, the fabric thin from years of service. The room was a testament to a life of honor, duty, and sacrifice. It was everything the Walkers, in their Brioni suits and their petty cruelties, were not. And there, tucked away under the massive, imposing oak desk, was what I had come for: an olive-drab, military-issue footlocker. It was old, probably from his days as a young officer. Stenciled on the lid in faded white letters were the words, "Walker, R." I looked from the footlocker to the old brass key in my hand. Everything had led me here. The years of questions, the pain of the father-daughter dance, the vow I made at the edge of Fort Bragg, the insults in the boardroom. It was all a map, and every road had converged on this single, cold, metal box. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the answer to who I was and who my mother was lay locked inside. I knelt on the hardwood floor of the general's study, the silence of the room pressing in on me. My hands, trained to suture the most complex wounds under pressure, were trembling. I slid the old brass key into the lock of the footlocker. It turned with a dry, grating click, a sound like a bone breaking. The heavy lid groaned as I lifted it, releasing a ghost from the past. The scent of old paper, of canvas, and a faint, phantom smell of long-faded gunpowder. Lying on top was a neatly folded uniform, the fabric yellowed with age. A combat medic's uniform. I lifted it gently, the worn cotton soft beneath my fingers, and underneath it, my breath caught in my throat. It was the photograph from Mr. Daniels's office, the original one. My mother, Willow, her face radiant with a joy I'd never known, dressed in the same uniform I now held. And beside her, Captain Raymond Walker, his arm slung protectively over her shoulder. They weren't just colleagues. They were comrades. They were family. Beneath the photo was a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting was a graceful, feminine cursive, yet the confident strokes of the pen spoke of a woman with resolve. I untied the ribbon, my fingers fumbling. I sank to the floor, my back against the cold metal of the footlocker, and began to read. The first letter started simply, "Dearest Raymond, my only ally." My heart ached at the greeting. The early letters painted a picture of a life I could barely imagine for my mother. She wrote of the pride she felt serving at Fort Bragg, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose. She wrote of falling in love with a young soldier, a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne, a man named David. Her words were full of hope and a simple, unadorned happiness. Then the tone shifted. The light in her letters began to dim. I read the next one, and the world began to spin. "Richard came to the base today, Ray. He drove down from D.C. It wasn't a social call. He knows about David. He does not approve. He said David is just some paratrooper, that his blood isn't good enough to mix with the Walkers. He said I was tarnishing the family name, that I was an embarrassment." My own blood ran cold. Richard, the general's older brother, Preston's father. The architect of the Walker dynasty, a powerful DC insider, a colonel at the time. I could feel the immense weight of his rank, his power, crashing down on my mother, a private first class with nothing but her honor. I picked up the next letter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the words. "Ray, there was an incident in Panama. David." "Oh God, Ray, David is gone. He was killed in action. I've lost him. And now Richard is circling like a vulture. He knows I'm pregnant. He says the child, my daughter, belongs to the family. He says he'll use his power, his connections, to prove I'm an unfit mother and take her from me." A wave of nausea washed over me. I had to stop reading, pressing the heel of my hand against my mouth. My father wasn't just a nameless man. He was a hero who had died for his country. And my mother. My mother hadn't just lost the love of her life. She was being hunted by a monster who shared her blood. I forced myself to continue reading her frantic, desperate script. He says he will raise her in the Walker tradition. He doesn't mean with love, Ray. He means like a tool for his ambition. I saw it in his eyes. It's a madness, a hunger for control. He doesn't want a niece. He wants an asset. The words suffocated me. The Walker tradition. I'd had a taste of it in that boardroom. The arrogance, the cruelty, the belief that they were above everyone else. They hadn't just inherited wealth. They had inherited a legacy of malice. Richard hadn't just threatened my mother. He had declared war on her. The final letter was on a single sheet of wrinkled, tear-stained paper. The ink was blurred in places, a permanent record of my mother's heartbreak. "I have to perform a strategic retreat, Raymond. It's the only way. I can't let him take Elizabeth from me. Don't look for me." Please, I'm begging you. It's the only way to keep her safe. If anyone asks, tell them I was a coward. Tell them I went AWOL. Let them hate me. I would rather carry this shame to my grave than let my daughter fall into his hands. Live a good life, my hero. All my love, Willow. Elizabeth. My name. At the very bottom of the footlocker, lying alone on the cold, hard metal, was a single dog tag. I picked it up. The metal was cool against my skin. I turned it over, and there, stamped into the silver, were the words I'd unknowingly been searching for my entire life. Spears, Elizabeth. That was it. The dam broke. The tears I had swallowed at the father-daughter dance, the tears I had choked back when my mother died, the tears I had refused to shed in that boardroom, they all came at once. A silent, gut-wrenching sob tore through me, the kind that leaves you hollowed out and gasping for air. My mother wasn't a deserter. She wasn't a disgrace. She was a soldier. A soldier who had been faced with an unwinnable battle against an enemy with overwhelming power. So she did what any good soldier would do. She made the impossible choice. She sacrificed her reputation, her honor, her family, everything, to protect her objective, to protect me. I clutched the dog tag to my chest, the sharp edges digging into my skin. The grief was a physical weight, crushing me. But underneath it, something else was stirring. The pilot light of determination I'd felt earlier roared to life, becoming a furnace of pure, cold rage. This was no longer just about my pain. This was about her sacrifice. A sacrifice the walkers had spit on. A sacrifice they would now answer for. My mission had just become crystal clear. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was about reclamation. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for Private First Class Willow Spears. I was still on the floor of the study, the dog tag a cold, hard promise clutched in my fist. The grief for my mother was a raw, open wound, but the rage was beginning to cauterize it, turning the pain into something focused, something hard. It was in this state of fragile resolve that the outside world invaded. A commotion from downstairs, loud voices, the sound of heavy objects being moved. I pushed myself to my feet, my joints aching, and walked to the doorway of the study, which overlooked the grand two-story foyer. What I saw below made my blood run cold all over again. Preston was there, his voice echoing off the marble floors as he directed two movers. He was pointing a manicured finger at the large, oil-painted portrait of the general that hung above the fireplace. "Take that one first," he commanded, his voice dripping with acquisitive glee. "And the metal display case next to it. They'll look fantastic in the grill room at my golf club." I stood frozen, watching in disbelief. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was a desecration. He wasn't just claiming assets. He was looting a shrine. He was tearing the soul out of this house, piece by piece, to use as decor for his shallow, extravagant life. Across the foyer, I saw Mrs. Avery standing in the shadows of an archway, her face pale, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked utterly helpless, a loyal guardian forced to watch as barbarians sacked her city. The fury in my chest burned hotter. And then, the unthinkable happened. The doorbell chimed. Mrs. Avery moved to answer it, admitting a young soldier, a private from the Army's Old Guard, immaculate in his dress blues. He was carrying a long, narrow box made of polished walnut. Inside, I knew, was the American flag that had been draped over my uncle's coffin. The symbol of his entire life of service, folded with sacred ceremony. The young soldier, his face solemn and professional, approached Mrs. Avery. "According to protocol, the flag is presented to the next of kin, or in their absence, the most trusted confidant." He was about to present it to her, but Preston stepped in, physically blocking his path. "I'll take that," he snapped, his voice sharp with entitlement. "I'm the primary heir." The private, clearly taken aback and confused by this breach of decorum, hesitated. Preston didn't wait. He snatched the wooden box from the soldier's hands. He didn't receive it with the reverence it deserved. He didn't even look at it. He simply grabbed it, turned, and tossed it carelessly onto a nearby armchair, as if it were a piece of inconvenient luggage. It landed with a dull, sickening thud. Then he immediately turned back to the movers. All right, let's get a move on. That thud was the sound of the last straw breaking. It broke something deep inside me. That flag wasn't just a piece of cloth, it was the embodiment of a sacred promise. It was the symbol of the general's sacrifice. It was the flag my mother, Willow, had served. It was the flag my father, David, had died for in the jungles of Panama. It was the flag I'd pledged my own life to. It represented every ideal I'd ever held dear: honor, duty, country. To see it treated like trash, like a discarded party favor by a man who had never served anyone but himself. It was a profanity beyond words. The hot, messy rage I'd felt before was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous, a cold, razor-sharp fury. My grief and my anger fused into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose. I squeezed the dog tag in my hand one last time. Enough. I remembered a quote I'd read in a history book a long time ago, words from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That had always stuck with me. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. My silence ended today. I turned and walked back into the study. The room no longer felt like a place of mourning. It felt like a command post. My movements became deliberate, efficient. I was no longer a grieving niece. I was a soldier preparing for an operation. First, reconnaissance. I laid out my mother's letters on the general's desk, my hands steady now. With methodical precision, I took out my phone and photographed every single page, creating a digital record. The truth was now portable. Next, securing the asset. I carefully placed the original letters back into a protective envelope I found in the desk drawer. They were the primary evidence. They had to be protected. Finally, the most important piece of equipment. I took my mother's dog tag, Elizabeth Spears, and slipped the chain over my head. I tucked it under my shirt where it rested cold against my skin, right over my heart. It was my armor. With everything secure, I picked up my phone. I scrolled through my contacts and found the number for Mr. Daniels. When I pressed the call button, my thumb was as steady as a rock. He answered on the second ring. Daniels. Mr. Daniels, I said. My voice was not the voice of the woman who had stood trembling in his office. It didn't waver. It didn't crack. It was the voice I used on the firing range, calm, controlled, and lethal. It's Sergeant Tanner. There was a pause on the other end. Sergeant, is everything all right? No, sir, I said, my eyes fixed on the scene of desecration still unfolding below me. It is not. It's time to launch a counteroffensive. There are some lines you just don't cross. If you believe honor and respect are more important than money, hit that like button right now. And in the comments, let me know one word, just one, that describes what Preston Walker is. 30 minutes after my call, I was back in Mr. Daniels's office, but this time, it felt different. It was no longer a lawyer's office, it was a tactical operations center. The battlefield was his vast mahogany desk, and I was laying out my ammunition. I placed my mother's letters in a neat line, followed by the photograph of her and the general. And finally, the single dog tag that now felt like the anchor of my entire identity. This is our evidence, I said, my voice crisp and clear. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. But the words of the dead can be disputed in court. A grieving daughter's story can be dismissed as emotional. We need something they can't argue with. Something irrefutable. I was thinking like a soldier, analyzing the terrain, identifying weaknesses in my position. My mother's letters were powerful, but a skilled lawyer could paint them as fiction. I needed a kill shot. Mr. Daniels nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a client anymore. He was looking at a comrade. The general anticipated this, he said, his voice low. He knew his family. He knew their capacity for denial and deceit. He turned to his safe and retrieved another sealed envelope. Before he passed, he gave me a specific and rather unusual instruction. He asked me to discreetly collect a few strands of hair from your brush while you were caring for him. I stared at him, stunned. I sent that sample, along with a sample of his own. To a private lab for a full DNA analysis, he continued, placing the envelope on the desk. He didn't want to presume, but he had to know for sure. The results are due back tomorrow morning. I was speechless. The old general, even in his final, pain-ridden days, had been a brilliant strategist. He hadn't just left me a mission. He had laid out the entire campaign, complete with logistics and secret weapons. He had planned for the battle that he knew would come after his death. A fresh wave of admiration and love for this man I barely knew washed over me. He had seen the fight coming, and he had armed me for it. "There's more," Mr. Daniels said, his eyes glancing toward the door. "There is someone else who wishes to speak with you." The office door opened, and Mrs. Avery stepped inside. She walked with the same quiet dignity as before, but now there was a fire in her eyes. In her hands she carried a thick, leather-bound journal. "Sergeant," she said, her voice filled with a new level of deference, "I believe this belongs in your arsenal." She placed the journal on the desk next to the letters. "This is the general's private diary. For 30 years, he wrote in it nearly every week. He wrote about his sister, Willow, about his guilt for not finding her, his regret, his unwavering love for her." She paused, taking a deep breath. Preston and his father always spoke of her as a family disgrace, a stain on their perfect lineage. This journal proves she was his greatest sorrow and his greatest source of pride. It will decimate their narrative. Mrs. Avery was no longer just the housekeeper. She was the keeper of the archives, the curator of memory, a living witness to the truth. "I will testify to every word," she said, her voice shaking slightly but firm with conviction. "I have stood by in silence for far too long." The three of us stood there for a moment, an unlikely platoon assembled in a DC office, the lawyer, the housekeeper, and the soldier. A team united by loyalty to a fallen commander. The plan came together quickly, like a well-executed field operation. Mr. Daniels would be the commanding officer. He would summon the Walker family for an emergency family meeting the following morning, using the legal pretext of updating an addendum to the will. It was the perfect bait. Their greed would ensure their attendance. I would be the one to deliver the intelligence briefing. I would present the truth, not as a supplicant asking for a share, but as an officer of the U.S. Army, carrying out the final unwritten order of a 4-star general. Mrs. Avery would provide the corroborating testimony, the emotional truth that would support the hard evidence of the letters and the journal. And the DNA results. The DNA results would be the final, undeniable airstrike. I looked at my allies, a powerful attorney who held the keys to the legal kingdom and a loyal housekeeper who held the keys to the family's heart. For the first time in this fight, for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't return to the general's residence. The thought of sleeping under the same roof as the jackals who were picking it apart was unbearable. Instead, I checked into a modest hotel in Arlington, Virginia, just a short drive from the quiet, hallowed grounds of the National Cemetery. My room was simple, anonymous. I laid my freshly pressed Army service uniform out on the bed. Then I began my ritual, the same one I've performed before every important inspection, every formal ceremony. I took out my polishing kit and went to work on my low-quarter dress shoes. Back and forth, small tight circles with the cloth, the smell of wax polish filling the air. This wasn't about fear or nerves. It was a meditation, a way of focusing the mind before battle. As I worked the leather to a mirror shine, I thought about the man who lay at rest just a few miles away. I remembered him telling me once that the key to any successful operation was to know the terrain and know the enemy's strength before you ever fire a shot. I was following his doctrine. I knew the terrain of their arrogance, and I knew the strength of the truth I now possessed. When the shoes were done, I stood and faced the mirror. I no longer saw the lost little girl from Fayetteville. I no longer saw the humiliated sergeant from the boardroom. I saw Elizabeth Spears Tanner, grandniece of General Raymond Walker, daughter of Private First Class Willow Spears, and the soldier entrusted with defending their legacy. I leaned closer to my reflection, the dog tag cool against my chest. "Tomorrow," I whispered. "Mission accomplished." The next morning, the conference room at Covington and Burling felt like a stage set for an execution. I arrived early, taking my seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. I was in my full Army service uniform, my shoes polished to a black mirror, my posture unwavering. I was not the same woman who had stood meekly in the corner of this room 2 days ago. I was an occupying force. The walkers arrived precisely on time, a flock of expensively dressed vultures descending for what they believed was the final feeding. They moved with an air of annoyed entitlement, their faces masks of impatience. Preston, predictably, spoke first, not even bothering to sit down. "Let's hope this is quick, Daniels," he said, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. "My time is money." Then they saw me. A collective ripple of shock and anger went through them. Eleanor, Preston's mother, was the first to voice it. "What is she doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. Mr. Daniels rose from his seat at the head of the table, his presence commanding the room. He didn't look like a family lawyer anymore. He looked like a federal judge about to deliver a verdict. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth, "this meeting was not called to update the will. It was called to execute it, specifically a portion of the will that has been suppressed for 30 years. All eyes were on him now. The trap was set. On cue, I stood up. My movements were measured, deliberate. I didn't look at the walkers. I focused on a point on the far wall, just above Preston's head, as if I were addressing a commanding officer. My voice, when I spoke, was calm, clear, and carried the unshakable authority of my rank. By the final order of General Raymond Walker, I am here today to declassify a sealed file. I lifted the olive drab footlocker and placed it on the table. It landed with a solid, definitive thump that echoed in the silent room. I unlatched the lid and retrieved the photograph of my mother and uncle. "This is Private First Class Willow Spears, combat medic, United States Army," I announced, holding up the photo for all to see. "Sister of General Raymond Walker, the woman this family falsely accused of desertion and dishonor." A wave of murmurs and denials swept through the Walker side of the table. I ignored them. I reached back into the footlocker and took out my mother's letters. I will now read excerpts from her final correspondence with her brother. And I began to read. I read her words about my father, David, the paratrooper killed in Panama. I read her words about Richard Walker's cruelty, about his threats to steal her child. My voice was a steady, emotionless monotone, the way a soldier reads an after-action report. Each word was a bullet, and I watched them hit their targets. I saw the Walkers' faces shift from smug annoyance to confusion, then to dawning, horrified recognition. The name, Richard, hung in the air like a poison gas, choking them into silence. Every syllable I spoke was a direct indictment of the man who had founded their dynasty, the father of their golden boy, Preston. Preston was the first to break. He threw his head back and let out a wild, barking laugh. It was a terrible, cracking sound, full of panic. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, his face flushed. "A few dusty old letters? How do we know she didn't just invent this whole pathetic story?" And that was the moment for our reinforcements to arrive. From the corner of the room where she had been standing in silent observation, Mrs. Avery took a single step forward. Her voice, though quiet, was perfectly clear. "I know," she said. Every head swiveled in her direction. "I was there," she continued, her gaze locked on Preston. "I was there when the general received her last letter. I watched him read it in his study. And I watched a 4-star general weep like a broken-hearted boy." Preston opened his mouth to retort, to dismiss the loyal housekeeper as he had dismissed me. But he never got the chance. Mr. Daniels played his final card. "While testimony and correspondence can be questioned," he said, his voice booming with legal authority, "scientific fact cannot." He clicked a button on a remote. A large screen descended from the ceiling, humming to life. Displayed on it was the official letterhead of a certified DNA diagnostics lab. There were 2 genetic profiles, side by side. One labeled Walker, Raymond, General, U.S. Army. The other, Tanner, Erica, Sergeant, U.S. Army. And below them, in bold red letters that seemed to burn into the very air of the room, was the conclusion. paternal uncle-niece. Relationship, probability. 99.9999%. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The kind of silence that follows a massive explosion when the world is just dust and ringing ears. It was over. Checkmate. For the first time, I allowed my eyes to meet theirs. I swept my gaze across the table, from Eleanor's ashen face to Preston's slack-jawed disbelief. My voice was no longer the flat tone of a report. It was low, personal, and utterly unforgiving. "You dismissed me because I am just a sergeant," I said, each word precise and weighted. But in the final months of his life, I was there. I held his hand when the nightmares came. I listened when he called out Willow's name in his sleep. Where were you? You were circling, waiting, too busy dividing up his assets to care about his honor. I let the accusation hang in the air, a final damning charge. The true legacy my uncle left behind isn't in a bank account. It is loyalty, it is honor, it is sacrifice. I paused, my eyes locking onto Preston's. These are things your money can never buy, and your power can never touch. And they are the only inheritance I have come here to claim. This meeting is over. I turned my back on them. Without a second glance, I walked toward the door, where Mrs. Avery and Mr. Daniels were waiting. Together, the three of us stepped out of the room, leaving the Walker family to drown in the wreckage of their lies, alone with their soulless, worthless fortune. Walking out of that law office for the second time, I expected to feel triumphant. I had won. The truth had won. I expected to feel a surge of elation, a release of all the pressure that had been building for a lifetime. But I felt nothing. The adrenaline from the confrontation drained away, leaving behind a hollow, echoing emptiness. The fury that had propelled me forward was gone, and in its place was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Winning a war, I was discovering, feels a lot like surviving a shipwreck. You're alive, but you're left shivering on a desolate shore. Mr. Daniels and Mrs. Avery must have seen the shock on my face. They gently guided me out of the building and into a taxi, directing the driver to a small, unassuming diner in Georgetown. It was the kind of timeless American place with red vinyl booths and the comforting clatter of plates and silverware. The air smelled of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon. It was so normal, so completely removed from the high-stakes drama I had just lived through, that it felt surreal. We slid into a booth, and a waitress with a tired smile took our order. I just asked for water. I sat there, staring out the window at the people walking by, living their ordinary lives, completely unaware of the tectonic plates that had just shifted under my feet. Mrs. Avery reached across the table and placed her warm, dry hand over mine. "You did it, my dear," she said softly, her eyes filled with a quiet pride. "You gave your mother and your uncle peace." I managed a small nod, my throat too tight to speak. She was right. I had honored them. But as I sat there, I knew with a chilling certainty that while the battle with the Walkers might be over, the war inside my own head was just beginning. In the military, we're trained for combat, but nobody really trains you for the silence that comes after. I realized my fight with this family had been its own kind of PTSD, a trauma inflicted not on a foreign battlefield, but in the supposed safety of my own bloodline. A few days later, I was back at the general's residence, sorting through his personal effects. It was a somber, quiet task. I was surrounded by the artifacts of a noble life, each object telling a story of honor and duty. As I was carefully wrapping his West Point saber, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number with a DC area code. My guard immediately went up. I answered. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a voice I now despised. "Elizabeth?" It was Preston. But his voice was stripped of its usual arrogance. In its place was a smooth, cloying tone that set off every alarm bell in my system. It was the sound of manipulation. I just wanted to say that I've been thinking," he began, his words slow and practiced. "This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. My father, he was just trying to protect the family name. That's all. But we're blood, you and I. No matter what. And I was thinking, maybe we can just put this all behind us. My mother is terribly upset. I listened in absolute silence. I waited for the words, "I'm sorry." I waited for an admission of guilt, a flicker of remorse, but they never came. All I heard were excuses, blame shifting, a pathetic attempt to leverage the very concept of family that he and his father had so brutally desecrated. He wasn't sorry for what they did. He was sorry they got caught. I took a long, slow breath. The old Erica, the girl who craved acceptance, might have wavered. But that girl was gone. I was no longer a soldier waiting for orders. I was the commander of my own life. I remembered the stories I'd heard in VA support groups, stories of veterans learning to draw new lines in the sand to protect their own peace. This was my line. "Preston," I said. My voice was as cold and hard as the steel of my mother's dog tag. "First," I said, "you will address me as Sergeant Tanner. Second, there was no misunderstanding. There was only greed and cruelty. And third," I paused, letting the weight of my final sentence settle. "Blood does not give you the right to inflict pain. This is the last time you and I will ever speak. Do not contact me again." I hung up before he could respond. Then, with a decisive tap of my thumb, I blocked his number. An incredible sense of power and relief washed over me. It wasn't the triumphant high I had expected, but something deeper, more meaningful. It was the feeling of a locked door, of a fortress wall being raised. I had just established my first sovereign border, and the peace I felt on my side of it was absolute. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't mean you have to let someone back into your life to hurt you again. Sometimes the most powerful form of self-respect is a clean, permanent break, the no-contact rule. That evening, I sat at the general's magnificent oak desk. I took out a single sheet of his heavy cream-colored stationery and began to write. But this letter wasn't for the living. "Mom," I wrote, "today I told your truth. I reclaimed your honor. I hope, wherever you are, you can be proud. I'm no longer Madison Carter, the woman who had to run. I am Sergeant Elizabeth Tanner, and I'm going to live the life you sacrificed everything to give me." When I was finished, I folded the letter carefully. I walked over to the olive drab footlocker, the one that had held her story for 30 years. I placed my letter inside, right beside the faded blue ribbon that had bound hers. Then, I closed the lid. It shut with a soft, final click. A chapter of my life, a chapter of pain, of secrets, of running, was finally, truly, over. After the legal dust had settled and the walkers had retreated into their gilded silence, Mr. Daniels summoned me to his office one last time. There was no tension in the air now, only a quiet sense of closure. He handed me a final envelope, this one thick and heavy, sealed with the general's wax signet ring. "He left this for you to open only after everything else was finished," Mr. Daniels said, his eyes kind. Back in the quiet solitude of the general's study, I broke the seal. It was a personal letter, written in his own hand. The script was frail, but the words were as strong as steel. He addressed it to both sides of me. "To Sergeant Tanner," it began, "and to Elizabeth, my dear niece." He wrote of his pride in learning that I had followed the family tradition of service, that I had chosen a life of honor just as he and his sister had. He wrote of his regret for the lost years, for the silence that had been imposed by his older brother's tyranny. And then he gave me my final orders. A single paragraph that would redefine my future, my purpose, and my entire life. "The assets I have left to you are not a gift for a life of leisure. Consider them instead to be the logistical support for your next mission. Use them to serve other soldiers, the ones who were not as fortunate as we were. Build something that heals. That is the true legacy of the Walker name, the one worth fighting for." I read the sentence again and again, the words blurring through my tears. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a request. Coming from a 4-star general, this was a direct order. And it was the greatest order I'd ever received. I did not sell the estate. I did not move away. I honored his command. The grand residence in Great Falls, once a symbol of the Walkers' cold ambition, was about to become something new. With the entirety of the inheritance as my operational budget, I began the largest mission of my life: to transform the house into a fortress of healing. We called it the Walker Spears Center for Veteran Support, a name that honored both my uncle's legacy and my mother's silenced sacrifice. I ran the project with the discipline of a non-commissioned officer. The grand ballroom, where the Walkers had once hosted lavish parties, became a state-of-the-art physical therapy facility. The library, once filled with unread classics, became a quiet space for mental health counseling and group therapy sessions. The general study, my command post, remained untouched, a tribute to the man whose vision had started it all. And Mrs. Avery, my first and most loyal ally, accepted the position of executive director, running the daily operations with the same grace and efficiency with which she had run the household for 40 years. Together, with a small team of dedicated professionals, we built a new kind of fortress, not for war, but for the warriors who had survived it. The opening day was a crisp autumn afternoon. The grounds were filled with veterans and their families, their quiet conversations and occasional laughter a stark contrast to the angry, grasping voices that had once echoed here. I stood near the entrance, greeting each person, my heart full. And then through the crowd I saw a familiar figure hesitating by the newly painted gates. It was Preston. He wasn't wearing a designer suit. He was in faded blue jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. He looked smaller, diminished, stripped of the armor of his wealth and arrogance. He walked toward me slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet my gaze. He stopped a few feet away, shifting his weight awkwardly. I waited, my posture neutral. He started, his voice barely a whisper. Could I help paint the fence? He didn't say he was sorry. An apology from him at that point would have been meaningless, another hollow word from a man who had used them as weapons. Instead, he offered an act of service, an act of labor, a small, humble gesture of wanting to contribute to the very thing he had once despised. I looked at him for a long moment. I saw the ghost of the arrogant man in the boardroom, but I also saw something new, a flicker of shame, a hint of a man untethered from the toxic legacy of his father. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel anything at all, except a quiet sense of finality. I gave a single, sharp nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a ceasefire. It was an acknowledgement that even the most shattered things could, perhaps, begin to be mended. Not with words, but with work. He turned and walked toward the supply shed, and I let him go. The story ends on an evening much like that one, a few months later. I was standing on the front porch of the center, watching the American flag, the general's flag, now flying proudly on a new pole, billow in the twilight breeze. The air was cool, smelling of wood smoke and fallen leaves. A young Marine, a double amputee, wheeled himself up beside me. He had been one of our first residents, arriving sullen, angry, and lost. Now his eyes were clear. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said, looking out at the sunset. "This place, it saved my life." I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. "Just following orders, Marine," I replied softly. My past was no longer a wound. It was a map. It had been a long, brutal, and painful journey, but it had led me exactly where I was meant to be. I finally understood that General Walker's true legacy wasn't in a vault in downtown DC, or in the medals in his study. It was here. It was in the quiet courage of this young Marine. It was in the laughter I could hear coming from the dining hall, where soldiers were sharing a meal, no longer alone. It was in the families being pieced back together in the counseling rooms. I was his living legacy. And this was a mission I would proudly carry out every single day for the rest of my life. My story isn't just about the family we're born into, but the family we build and the purpose we find. It's about turning pain into power. My past doesn't define me anymore. My mission does. Thank you for being here and listening to my journey. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience and survival. Most importantly, if you or someone you know is a veteran in need, remember that you are not alone. There is always a new mission waiting.